In the summer of 1944, as Allied forces stormed ashore in Normandy and the world's attention fixed on Western Europe, another storm was gathering in the east, one far larger, far more destructive, and far less anticipated by the German High Command. When Operation Bagration began on June 22, 1944, many German generals believed it to be a diversion, a supporting attack designed to draw attention away from the true Soviet objective farther south. Within weeks, that miscalculation would erase an entire German army group from the map. The Eastern Front in mid-1944 stretched across thousands of kilometers, a brutal scar running from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Germany's Army Group Center held the central sector in Belarus, anchoring the German line with fortified positions, defensive belts, and hardened strongpoints built over years of occupation. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded the formation, and like many within the German High Command, he believed the main Soviet summer offensive would strike Ukraine, where terrain favored armored breakthroughs. The Central Front, with its marshes and forests, seemed less suitable for massive Soviet operations. But the Red Army had been learning. After catastrophic losses in 1941 and 1942, the Soviet military had rebuilt itself into a formidable machine. Industrial production had surged east of the Ural Mountains. Tank factories ran relentlessly. Artillery stockpiles multiplied. By 1944, Soviet commanders had mastered the art of deception, maskirovka, using camouflage, misinformation, and false troop movements to disguise true intentions. German aerial reconnaissance, once dominant, now struggled against improved Soviet air defenses and weather conditions. On the third anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, Soviet artillery opened fire across a vast front. Thousands of guns unleashed a thunderous bombardment that shook the forests and swamps of Belarus. The ground trembled continuously as shells rained down on German trenches, command posts, and communication lines. For German soldiers on the front lines, it felt like the sky itself had collapsed. Yet at higher headquarters, some officers remained skeptical. They believed this was a feint. The main blow, they insisted, would fall elsewhere. The illusion lasted only hours. When the Soviet infantry and armored units surged forward behind rolling artillery barrages, the scale of the assault became undeniable. Entire Soviet fronts, comprising multiple armies, advanced simultaneously. The objective was not a limited penetration, but annihilation. The Red Army aimed to encircle and destroy Army Group Center completely. German defensive doctrine relied heavily on holding fortified strongpoints and launching counterattacks with mobile reserves. But by mid-1944, reserves were scarce. Many armored divisions had been redeployed to France or to southern sectors. Fuel shortages hampered movement. Luftwaffe support was minimal compared to earlier years. As Soviet forces smashed into the German line, local counterattacks quickly faltered. At Vitebsk, Soviet forces encircled entire German corps. Artillery fire severed supply routes, communications broke down. German units that once fought with grim determination now found themselves cut off, surrounded by mechanized formations supported by overwhelming air power. Soviet aircraft strafed retreating columns, turning forest roads into graveyards of vehicles and men. Within days, the front began to dissolve. Field commanders urgently requested permission to withdraw to more defensible lines, but Adolf Hitler's orders were explicit: hold ground at all costs. Strongpoints were to become fortresses, defending their positions even when encircled. The intention was to buy time, to stabilize the line. In reality, it condemned entire divisions to destruction. As Soviet armored spearheads advanced deeper, German formations were split apart. Encirclements formed rapidly, trapping tens of thousands. The Red Army's coordination had reached a new level of sophistication. Infantry, tanks, artillery, and air units operated in synchronized waves. River crossings were executed with precision. Engineers erected bridges under fire. Supply columns followed close behind, ensuring momentum did not falter. German commanders who initially dismissed the offensive as deception now confronted a catastrophic reality. This was not a diversion, it was the main effort. By early July, Soviet forces had liberated Minsk, encircling large elements of Army Group Center east of the city. The pocket tightened relentlessly. Desperate breakout attempts failed under relentless artillery fire and aerial bombardment. Entire divisions ceased to exist as coherent units. The destruction was staggering. In a matter of weeks, Germany lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, killed, wounded, or captured. Equipment losses were immense. Armored vehicles burned along roadsides. Artillery pieces lay abandoned in fields. The old, once stable Central Front collapsed into chaos. The psychological impact on the German high command was profound. For years, despite setbacks at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Wehrmacht had managed to restore defensive lines, but Operation Bagration shattered that pattern. Army Group Center was not merely pushed back, it was effectively destroyed. Soviet momentum did not slow. As they advanced westward, they crossed into Poland, bringing the war closer to Germany's own borders. The Eastern Front, which had once seemed distant to many German civilians, now loomed with terrifying proximity. Operation Bagration coincided with the Allied invasion of Normandy, stretching German resources to the breaking point. Two massive offensives, one from the west, one from the east, converged against the Third Reich. Strategic flexibility evaporated. Every lost division in Belarus could not be replaced quickly enough. Historians often compare the scale of Bagration to the Normandy landings. In terms of casualties and territorial gains, the Soviet offensive was even larger, yet it unfolded far from Western headlines, overshadowed in global memory by events in France. For the German army, however, it was perhaps the single most devastating defeat of the war. When it began, many German generals believed it to be a deception. They underestimated Soviet capability and intent. Within weeks, that misjudgment erased Army Group Center as an effective fighting force. The forests and marshes of Belarus became silent witnesses to one of the greatest military catastrophes in modern history.
By mid-July 1944, the full scale of the catastrophe unleashed by Operation Bagration could no longer be denied. What had begun as a thunderous artillery barrage on June 22 had evolved into one of the most devastating offensives in military history. The German Army Group Center, once considered a stable anchor of the Eastern Front, had been shattered beyond recovery. Entire corps had vanished inside Soviet encirclements. Headquarters staffs were captured or killed. Communication networks lay in ruins. The front no longer resembled a continuous defensive line. It had become a series of collapsing fragments. In the early days of the offensive, some German officers still clung to the belief that order could be restored through disciplined withdrawals and counterattacks, but Soviet momentum proved relentless. The Red Army did not pause after encirclements. Once pockets were sealed, follow-on forces pressed westward, maintaining pressure on retreating German units. The operational tempo, something the Germans themselves had once mastered in 1941, now belonged fully to the Soviets. The fall of Minsk on July 3 symbolized the destruction of Army Group Center. Large numbers of German troops were trapped east of the city in a vast pocket. Attempts to break out were chaotic and desperate. Columns of exhausted soldiers moved through forests under constant artillery fire and air attack. German aircraft dominated the skies, strafing roads and bombing bridges. German supply lines had disintegrated, fuel was scarce, ammunition dwindled, vehicles were abandoned when they ran dry. As Soviet forces tightened the Minsk encirclement, thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Estimates vary, but the losses were staggering, well over 300,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. Compared to the destruction at Stalingrad, Bagration was broader in scope and even more strategically crippling. At Stalingrad, a single army had been encircled. In Belarus, an entire army group collapsed. Adolf Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs had compounded the disaster. Fortress cities such as Vitebsk and Orsha were ordered to stand firm despite being strategically untenable. When Soviet armor bypassed these positions, the garrisons found themselves isolated. Appeals to withdraw came too late or were denied outright. The doctrine of rigid defense, once intended to prevent panic retreats, instead guaranteed annihilation. Meanwhile, Soviet coordination reached a new level of operational art. Multiple fronts, massive formations equivalent to army groups, advanced in synchronized phases. The Red Army had mastered deep battle doctrine, striking not just frontline units, but operational depth, command centers, rail hubs, logistics depots. German reserves could not assemble quickly enough to mount effective counterblows. The fall of Minsk on July 3 symbolized the destruction of Army Group Center. Large numbers of German troops were trapped east of the city in a vast pocket. Attempts to break out were chaotic and desperate. Columns of exhausted soldiers moved through forests under constant artillery fire and air attack. German aircraft dominated the skies, strafing roads and bombing bridges. German supply lines had disintegrated. Fuel was scarce, ammunition dwindled, vehicles were abandoned when they ran dry. As Soviet forces tightened the Minsk encirclement, thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Estimates vary, but the losses were staggering, well over 300,000 casualties in a matter of weeks. Compared to the destruction at Stalingrad, Bagration was broader in scope and even more strategically crippling. At Stalingrad, a single army had been encircled. In Belarus, an entire army group collapsed. Adolf Hitler's insistence on holding ground at all costs had compounded the disaster. Fortress cities such as Vitebsk and Orsha were ordered to stand firm despite being strategically untenable. When Soviet armor bypassed these positions, the garrisons found themselves isolated. Appeals to withdraw came too late or were denied outright. The doctrine of rigid defense, once intended to prevent panic retreats, instead guaranteed annihilation. Meanwhile, Soviet coordination reached a new level of operational art. Multiple fronts, massive formations equivalent to army groups, advanced in synchronized phases. The Red Army had mastered deep battle doctrine, striking not just frontline units, but operational depth, command centers, rail hubs, logistics depots. German reserves could not assemble quickly enough to mount effective counterblows. The psychological shock rippled through the German high command. Field Marshal Ernst Busch was relieved of command and replaced by Walter Model, a specialist in defensive warfare. Model attempted to stabilize the front through rapid improvisation, but the situation he inherited was beyond repair. He faced a collapsing theater, insufficient reserves, and an enemy whose strength continued to grow. Operation Bagration did not merely push German forces back, it shattered their structural coherence. Divisions that had existed since the early campaigns in Poland and France ceased to function. Veteran officers were lost in vast numbers. Equipment stocks, already strained by the simultaneous Allied invasion of Normandy, were depleted further. Germany now fought a two-front war under conditions of severe attrition. As Soviet armies surged westward into Poland and toward the Baltic states, the geopolitical implications became clear. The Red Army was not simply reclaiming Soviet territory, it was advancing into Eastern Europe. Cities long under German occupation fell in rapid succession. Rail networks that once fed German offensives now carried Soviet supply trains. The strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. While Western headlines focused on battles in Normandy following the D-Day landings, the scale of destruction in the East dwarfed much of what occurred in France during the same period. The Wehrmacht in the West still possessed armored divisions capable of counterattack. In the East, entire formations had vanished. German civilians began to sense the approaching tide. Refugee columns formed in eastern territories as rumors spread of advancing Soviet forces. The war, once distant from Germany's core regions, now moved steadily toward its borders. The illusion that setbacks could be absorbed and reversed faded rapidly. For the Soviet Union, Operation Bagration marked a vindication of years of sacrifice. Since 1941, Soviet forces had endured devastating losses, brutal occupations, and immense suffering. Now the momentum was theirs. The offensive demonstrated the Red Army's transformation from a battered force fighting for survival into a sophisticated military machine capable of executing vast, coordinated operations across hundreds of kilometers. The destruction of Army Group Center also had strategic ripple effects. Germany was forced to divert resources from other fronts to plug the widening gap in the east. This weakened its ability to respond effectively in France and Italy. The strain on logistics intensified. Fuel shortages worsened. Replacement divisions were often under strength and poorly equipped. By late summer 1944, the Eastern Front bore little resemblance to its configuration earlier that year. Soviet spearheads stood on the Vistula River, poised for future advances towards Warsaw and eventually Berlin. The Baltic states were increasingly isolated. German formations in the north risked encirclement as well. Historians frequently describe Operation Bagration as the greatest defeat in German military history, not because it was sudden, but because it was comprehensive. It destroyed manpower, equipment, morale, and strategic positioning simultaneously. The Wehrmacht, which had once launched lightning offensives deep into Soviet territory, now reeled from an onslaught it could neither anticipate nor contain. The miscalculation at the outset, believing the offensive to be a diversion, proved fatal. German intelligence had underestimated Soviet capabilities and intentions. Maskirovka had concealed troop concentrations and artillery buildup. When the storm broke, it did so with overwhelming force. In the broader context of World War II, Operation Bagration stands as a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. It ensured that Germany would fight the remainder of the war on the defensive, retreating steadily toward its own territory. The Red Army's advance would continue through Poland, into East Prussia, and eventually to Berlin itself. What began on June 22, 1944, dismissed by some as a mere feint, ended with the erasure of Army Group Center from the order of battle.